Welcome! In this lecture, we're going to cover one of the most fundamental and important concepts in JavaScript, functions. We'll look at what functions are, why we use them, how to pass data into them using parameters, how to get data back out using return values, and finally, we'll look at a modern shorthand called arrow functions. Let's dive in. So, what exactly is a function? A function is simply a block of code, but what makes it special is that it's reusable. Instead of writing the same code over and over again, you write it once inside a function, and then you can use it as many times as you want. The instructor describes it as a reusable block of code that performs a specific task. That's the key idea. It does one specific job, and you can call it whenever you need that job done. Here's a great analogy the instructor uses. Think about a TV's power button. The code that turns the TV on and off exists inside the device, but it doesn't run automatically. It only runs when you press the power button. That's exactly how a function works. The code sits inside the function and does nothing until you call it. Without functions, if you wanted to print something 3 times, you'd write the same line 3 times. With a function, you write the logic once and just call it 3 times. That's the power of reusability. Let's look at the 2 steps involved in using a function. First, you define it. You use the keyword function, give it a name, and put your code inside curly braces. Second, you call it. You write the function name followed by parentheses. That's it. The instructor makes an important point here. The code inside a function does not run automatically. It only runs when you explicitly call the function. This is different from regular code that runs line by line as soon as the file loads.
Now, what if we want to send different data into a function each time we call it? That's where parameters come in. A parameter is a placeholder variable defined inside the function's parentheses. When you call the function and pass a value, that value is called an argument, it gets stored in the parameter and can be used inside the function. In the example here, the function hello has a parameter called data. When we call hello with hi, the word hi gets stored in data and printed. When we call it with abcd, that gets printed instead. The same function, different results each time. That's the beauty of parameters.
The instructor briefly mentions the difference between arguments and parameters, and also says you don't need to stress about memorizing the terminology. But let's clarify it anyway. A parameter is what you defined in the function. It's like a variable name that will hold whatever gets passed in. An argument is the actual value you pass when you call the function. So in hello data, data is the parameter, and in hello hi, the string hi is the argument. Same concept, just 2 different perspectives, one from the function definition, one from the function call. Here's an interesting insight the instructor shares. You've been using console.log this whole time, but did you realize it's actually a function? It's a built-in JavaScript function that takes whatever you pass into it as an argument and prints it to the console. It works exactly the same way as the custom hello function we just built. The only difference is that console.log is written by the JavaScript engine itself, deep in the source code. We can't easily see that code, but conceptually it's the same pattern, a function that accepts data and does something with it. Let's look at a real-world style example. Suppose you have code that checks a temperature value and tells you whether it's very hot, cold, or normal. If you write this as plain inline code, it runs once and you're done. But if you wrap it in a function called checkTemperature, now you can call it with any temperature value you want, 90 degrees, 9 degrees, 60 degrees, and it will give you the right answer each time. The instructor also mentions preferring snake case naming, like checkTemperature, over camel case because it's visually clearer. Both are valid in JavaScript. Functions can also accept more than one parameter. You just separate them with commas. In this example, the function add takes 2 parameters, a and b. When you call add with 2 and 3, the value 2 goes into a and 3 goes into b, based on position. The first argument always goes to the first parameter, the second to the second, and so on. The function then adds them together and prints the result. This is how you pass multiple pieces of data into a single function. Now, let's talk about the return statement. This is where things get really powerful. So far, we've been using console.log inside functions to print results. But console.log only prints to the console. You can't use that value anywhere else in your code. The return statement is different. When a function uses return, it sends the value back to wherever the function was called from. You can then store that returned value in a variable and use it however you like. Multiply it, pass it to another function, display it on a web page. The instructor puts it simply. Console.log is just for printing and testing. Return is for actually using the value. Let's walk through exactly what happens when a function uses return.
First, you call the function and assign it to a variable, like let r equal add23. The function runs, calculates the result, and then hits the return statement. At that point, it sends the value back, in this case 5, and immediately stops executing. Any code you write after the return inside the function will simply never run. The returned value, 5, is now stored in the variable r, and you can use r anywhere you want in your code. This is a crucial concept. Return both delivers a value and exits the function.
Here's an important concept related to return: variable scope. When you declare a variable inside a function using let, that variable only exists inside that function. It's trapped in what we call the function scope. If you try to use it outside the function, JavaScript will throw an error because it simply doesn't know about that variable. This is why return exists. If you need the data that was computed inside a function to be available outside of it, you must return it. Once returned, you can catch it in a variable in the outer scope and use it freely. Now, let's look at arrow functions. Arrow functions are a more modern way to write functions in JavaScript, and they're very commonly used, especially in frameworks like Laravel's front-end tools. The good news is that an arrow function does exactly the same thing as a regular function. The syntax is just different. Instead of writing the function keyword, you store the function in a const variable, and you add an arrow, that's the equal sign followed by a greater than sign, between the parentheses and the curly braces. That's the core transformation. The instructor walks through the conversion step by step, which is a great way to understand it. Start with your regular function. First, remove the function keyword. Then, add const at the beginning and an equal sign after the function name. Finally, add the arrow, the fat arrow symbol, between the parentheses and the opening curly brace. And that's it. You've converted a regular function to an arrow function. The way you call it remains exactly the same. Just write the name followed by parentheses. Arrow functions have one more trick up their sleeve. If the body of your function is just a single line of code, you can drop the curly braces entirely. So instead of writing the arrow followed by curly braces and then your code, you just write the arrow and then the code directly. This makes simple functions incredibly compact and readable. The instructor points out that this is one of the main reasons arrow functions are popular. They're perfect for short, one-liner functions. Both versions behave identically. It's purely a style choice. Here's a clean summary of the differences between regular functions and arrow functions. The syntax is different. Regular functions use the function keyword, while arrow functions use const and the arrow symbol. For one-liners, arrow functions can skip the curly braces entirely. Parameters work the same way in both. You just list them inside the parentheses. The key takeaway is that these are not two different things. They're two different ways to write the same thing. The instructor emphasizes this clearly. It's the same function, just a different format. In modern JavaScript, and especially in frameworks, you'll see arrow functions used very frequently. Let's make sure the distinction between console.log and return is crystal clear, because this trips up a lot of beginners. Console.log is purely for printing. It's a debugging tool. You use it to see what's happening in your code during development, and then you typically remove it later. The value it prints cannot be captured or used anywhere else. Return, on the other hand, is how a function communicates its result back to the rest of your program. When a function returns a value, you can store it, pass it to another function, display it to a user, anything. In real applications, return is what you'll use most of the time. Let's quickly recap the key ideas from this session. 1. A function is a reusable block of code designed to perform a specific task. 2. Functions do not run automatically, they only execute when you call them. 3. Parameters let you pass data into a function, making it flexible and reusable with different inputs. 4. The return statement sends a computed value back out of the function, so it can be used elsewhere in your program. And 5. Variables declared inside a function are scoped to that function and cannot be accessed outside without returning them. And 6. Arrow functions are simply a cleaner, more modern syntax for writing functions. Same behavior, different format. These fundamentals will come up constantly as we move into Laravel and beyond. So, continuing from where we left off, we were talking about what a function actually is. The key idea is this: a function is still just a block of code, but the difference is that you can reuse it. It performs one specific task, and it only runs when you explicitly call it. Think about a TV remote's power button. The code that turns the TV on or off doesn't just run by itself, it waits. When you press the button, that's the call. That's what triggers the code to execute. Now, without a function, your code runs immediately, line by line, as soon as the program starts.
But once you wrap that same code inside a function, it just sits there, ready and waiting until you call it. That's the fundamental shift, from code that runs automatically to code that runs on demand. The power button analogy really helps make this concrete. Imagine the code inside a function is like the electronics inside a TV remote's power button. The circuitry is there, it's ready, but nothing happens until you actually press the button. In the same way, a function definition just sets up the code. It says, here's what I can do. But the actual execution, the actual running of that code, only happens when you call it. This is what makes functions so powerful. You write the logic once, and then you can trigger it as many times as you need from anywhere in your program, just by calling it. That's the reusability aspect. Write once, use many times. Now, in JavaScript, there are two main types of functions you'll encounter. The first is the regular function. This is the traditional way of writing functions, using the function keyword. This is the syntax you'll see a lot in PHP-based environments like Laravel and Filament. The second type is the arrow function. This is the modern syntax, and it's extremely common in frameworks like React. Instead of writing the function keyword, you use a const variable and the arrow notation, the equal sign followed by a greater than sign. Both types do the same fundamental job. The difference is mostly in syntax, and some subtle behavioral differences we'll explore later. For now, the important thing is to recognize both forms and understand that arrow functions are the modern standard, especially in front-end development.
Let's break down the anatomy of a regular function. You start with the function keyword. This tells JavaScript that you're defining a function. Then comes the function name, which is what you'll use to call it later. In this case, the name is add. Inside the parentheses are the parameters. These are the inputs the function accepts. Here we have A and B. When you call the function and pass in values, those values get assigned to these parameters by position. So if you call add to 3, then A gets the value 2 and B gets the value 3. Inside the curly braces is the function body. This is the actual code that runs when the function is called. And at the bottom, add to 3 is the function call. This is what triggers everything to execute.
This is one of the most important distinctions to understand when working with functions, the difference between console.log and return. Console.log simply prints a value to the browser's developer console. It's great for testing and debugging. You can see what's happening inside your function, but that value stays inside the function. It cannot be used anywhere else in your program. Return, on the other hand, sends the value back out of the function to wherever it was called from. Once a function returns a value, you can capture that value in a variable and use it anywhere. Multiply it, pass it to another function, display it on a web page, whatever you need. So console.log is for seeing things during development. Return is for actually using values in your application logic. Let's trace through exactly how return works, step by step. When you call add to 3, the function receives those values. A becomes 2 and B becomes 3, assigned by their position in the argument list. Then result is calculated as 5. When the function hits the return result line, two things happen simultaneously. The function exits immediately, and the value 5 is sent back to wherever the function was called from. This is a critical point. Anything written after the return statement inside the function will never run. The function has already exited. You can see in the example that the console.log after the return is unreachable code. Back outside the function, the returned value 5 is captured in the variable r. Now you can use r anywhere in your program. It holds that result and is fully accessible outside the function. Here's the underlying reason why return exists. It's all about variable scope. When you declare a variable inside a function using let, that variable only exists within that function. It's trapped inside what we call the function scope. The moment the function finishes executing, that variable is gone. You cannot access it from outside the function. So if you have a calculation happening inside a function and you need that result somewhere else in your program, maybe to display it on a web page or to use it in another calculation, you have a problem. The variable is locked inside the function. Return is the solution. It takes the value and sends it out of the function scope, back to the caller. The caller can then store it in a new variable that lives in the outer scope, making it accessible wherever you need it. This is why return is so fundamental to writing useful functions. One important practical note about console.log, it's a development tool, not a production tool. When you're learning or debugging, console.log is incredibly useful. You can see what values are inside your function, check if your logic is correct, and trace through your program's execution. But it's important to understand that the output appears in the browser's developer tools console, not on the actual web page your users see.
Also, every console.log statement has a small performance cost. It might seem negligible, but if you have many of them scattered throughout your code, they add up and can slow down your application. That's why the best practice is to use console.log during development and testing, and then remove them before you deploy to production. And just to be clear about the bigger picture, when we eventually move to Laravel and Blade templates, displaying data on an actual web page is handled completely differently. Console.log is purely a JavaScript debugging tool.
Let's make this concrete with a practical example of how you actually use a returned value. If you call a function that returns something but don't capture the return value, that value is simply lost. The function ran, produced a result, and that result disappeared into the void. But when you write let r equals add 2, 3, you're telling JavaScript, run this function, take whatever it returns, and store it in the variable r. Now r holds the value 5, and you can do anything with it. Log it, multiply it, pass it to another function, use it in a condition, display it on a page. This is the real power of return. It transforms your function from a one-way process into something that produces a result you can work with. Any function that returns a value can be assigned to a variable, and that variable becomes your handle to that result.
Let's put the two function types side by side as a quick reference. The regular function uses the function keyword, followed by the name, parameters in parentheses, and the body in curly braces. This is the classic traditional syntax. You'll see this a lot in PHP-influenced environments, like Laravel's Filament. The arrow function achieves the same thing, but with a more compact, modern syntax. You declare a const variable, assign it an arrow function using the equals arrow notation, and the body works the same way. This syntax is dominant in React and modern JavaScript development. Both produce identical results in most cases. The choice between them often comes down to the context and the framework you're working in. As you move into more advanced JavaScript and front-end frameworks, you'll naturally gravitate toward arrow functions. But understanding regular functions is essential because you'll encounter them constantly in existing codebases and back-end environments.
Picking up right where we left off, we were talking about functions, and now we need to look at the two main types of functions you'll encounter in modern JavaScript. On the left, you have the regular function. This is the classic, traditional syntax that's been around since the beginning of JavaScript. On the right, you have the arrow function. This is the modern syntax that's become extremely common in frameworks like React and Filament. Both types do the same fundamental job. They wrap a block of code that can be called whenever you need it. The difference is mostly in how you write them and in some subtle behaviors we'll get into. Let's zoom in on the regular function first. The syntax starts with the keyword function. This tells JavaScript that what follows is a function definition. Then you give it a name. In this example, the name is hello. The name can be anything you want, but it should be meaningful so you know what the function does. After the name, you have a pair of small brackets. These are where parameters go, which we'll cover shortly. Then you have a pair of curly braces, and everything inside those curly braces is the body of the function. That's where you write all your logic and code. Here's a really important distinction that trips up a lot of beginners. Just writing a function does not execute it. Look at the left panel. The function is defined, but nothing happens. The console stays empty. Why? Because we never told JavaScript to actually run it. On the right panel, after defining the function, we write hello : That's the function call, the name of the function followed by parentheses. The moment JavaScript sees that, it jumps into the function body and executes whatever is inside. So remember, defining a function is like writing a recipe. Calling the function is like actually cooking the dish. So when exactly does a function get called? There are a few different scenarios. The first is a direct call. You literally write the function name with parentheses in your code, and it runs as soon as that line is reached. The second, and far more common in real applications, is an event trigger. For example, a user clicks a button on your web page, and that click event triggers a function to run. The third way is when another method or function calls it internally. In practice, most of the functions you write in frameworks like React or Laravel's Filament will be triggered by user actions or system events, not called directly in a straight line. One of the biggest reasons we use functions is reusability. Imagine you need to print a message in 10 different places in your code. Without a function, you'd have to write console.log 10 times. If you ever want to change how that message is printed, you'd have to update all 10 places. But with a function, let's say a simple function called p, you define the logic once, and then you just call p wherever you need it. If you need to change the behavior, you change it in one place, and it updates everywhere. This is a core principle of good programming. Don't repeat yourself. Now let's look at the arrow function. This is the modern way of writing functions, and you'll see it everywhere in contemporary JavaScript, especially in React and in Filament, which is the admin panel framework used with Laravel. The key differences are, first, there's no function keyword. Instead, you store the function in a variable using const. Second, after the parentheses, you write an arrow. That's the equal sign followed by a greater than sign, like this, arrow. Then the curly braces follow as usual. The behavior is essentially the same for most use cases, but the syntax is cleaner and more concise, which is why modern developers prefer it.
To give you some real-world context, in React, almost every component and handler you write will use the arrow function syntax. You'll see const myComponent equals parentheses arrow function all the time. In Filament, which is the Laravel-based admin panel framework that this course is building toward, you'll also encounter arrow functions frequently in JavaScript interactions. So while regular functions are perfectly valid and important to understand, getting comfortable with arrow functions is essential for modern development. Both syntaxes are worth knowing: regular functions for foundational understanding, arrow functions for day-to-day modern coding.
Let's talk about console.log, because it's something you'll use constantly while learning, but it's important to understand exactly what it is and what it isn't. Console.log simply prints a value to the browser's developer console, that panel you open with F12 in your browser. It does not output anything to the actual web page that users see. It's purely a developer tool. You use it to check values, test logic, and debug your code while you're building. But, and this is important, you should always remove console.log statements before you ship your code to production. Every console.log call, even small ones, adds a tiny bit of overhead and can slow down your application. Think of it as a sticky note you use while working, useful during the process, but not something you leave in the final product.
There's a question that comes up a lot when people first start using console.log. They wonder if the output they see in the console is the same as what appears on the web page. The answer is no. Console.log output only appears in the browser's developer tools console. Regular users visiting your website will never see it. When you want to actually display data on a web page in Laravel, you use Blade templates. That's Laravel's templating engine, and it has its own syntax for rendering data to the page. We're using console.log right now purely to learn and test JavaScript concepts. Later in the course, when we move into Laravel and Filament, we'll use the proper Blade template approach to display output to users.
Now we're getting to one of the most powerful features of functions, parameters. Let me walk you through a real-world scenario to make this concrete. Imagine you build a form on your website. A user fills in their name, email, and password. They click Submit. That data needs to travel from the front end to the back end, to your Laravel application. On the back end, there's a function waiting to receive that data and save it to the database. But how does that data actually get into the function? That's exactly what function parameters are for. A parameter is a variable you define in the function's parentheses that acts as a placeholder for data that will be passed in when the function is called. This is how functions become dynamic and reusable. They can work with different data every time they're called.
Now let's talk about arrow functions and how they relate to the regular functions we just covered. The instructor makes a really important point here. These two are almost identical in what they do. The only thing that changes is the format, the syntax. On the left, you have a regular function. You write the keyword function, give it a name like hello, open parentheses, open curly braces, and write your code inside. On the right, you have the arrow function version of the exact same thing. Instead of starting with the function keyword, you declare a variable, typically using const, give it the same name, put an equal sign, then write the parentheses, followed by the arrow symbol, which is just an equal sign and a greater than sign, and then your curly braces with the code inside. Same behavior, same output, just a different way of writing it.
Let's walk through the conversion step by step, because the instructor actually does this live to make it crystal clear. Step 1. You start with a regular function. You have the function keyword, the name hello, parentheses, and curly braces with code inside. Step 2. You replace the function keyword with const, and you assign the function to that variable using an equal sign. At this point, it still looks a bit like a regular function. Step 3. You remove the remaining function keyword and add the arrow symbol, that's equals and greater than, right after the closing parentheses. Now you have a proper arrow function. Step 4, and this is the really neat part. If your function body only has a single line of code, you can drop the curly braces entirely and write everything on one line. This is why arrow functions are often called one-liner functions. They're compact and clean. All 4 of these versions produce the exact same result.
The arrow function is just a more modern, concise way to write functions in JavaScript.
So why do we even bother with arrow functions? The instructor explains that in React and in Filament, which is the framework this course focuses on, arrow functions are used extensively. You'll see them everywhere. The main advantage is conciseness. When you have a simple single-line function, the arrow function lets you skip the curly braces and write everything in one clean line. That's much easier to read when you're scanning through a large codebase. It's worth noting that both formats are valid JavaScript. The instructor is clear. It's the same function, just a different format. Because modern frameworks like React heavily favor arrow functions, it's important to get comfortable with this syntax early on. Here's a quick side-by-side reference to lock in the differences between regular functions and arrow functions. The syntax is the most obvious difference. Regular functions use the function keyword, while arrow functions use const with the arrow symbol. For one-liners, arrow functions win on compactness. You can drop the curly braces entirely. In terms of usage, you'll encounter arrow functions far more often in React and modern JavaScript frameworks. But here's the most important thing to remember, and the instructor repeats this. The behavior is the same. A function is a function. It's a reusable block of code that performs a specific task. Whether you write it as a regular function or an arrow function, it does the same job. The format is just a matter of style and convention. Before we wrap up, let's address a question that came up in class, the difference between console.log and return. This is a really important distinction. Console.log is purely for testing and debugging. When you write console.log, you're telling JavaScript to print something to the browser's developer console so you can see it. It's like a window into your code while you're building it. But that value doesn't go anywhere useful. It just shows up in the console. Return, on the other hand, is how a function sends a value back to whoever called it. So if you have a function that calculates something, you use return to hand that result back so it can be stored in a variable or used in another part of your code. The instructor mentions that in Laravel and Filament, which is what this course is building toward, return is what you'll actually use in practice. Console.log is more of a development tool to check that things are working correctly. Let's revisit the temperature example the instructor uses, because it perfectly illustrates why parameters are so powerful. Here we have a function called checkTemperature. It takes one parameter called temp. Inside the function, there's logic that checks whether the temperature is very hot, cold, or normal. Now watch what happens when we call this function multiple times with different arguments. We pass 90, it says very hot. We pass 9, it says cold. We pass 25, it says normal. The same function, the same block of code, handles all three cases. We didn't have to write three separate if-else blocks. We just wrote the logic once and called the function with different data each time. This is the real power of function parameters. In a real application, like a form that submits user data to a backend, the function stays the same, but the data that flows through it changes every time a user submits something. The parameter is the channel through which that data travels. The instructor walks through a really practical example to show why all of this matters in the real world. Imagine you're building a web application with a form, maybe a registration form or a contact form. The user fills in their details and clicks submit. That click triggers a function on the front end. The data the user entered gets passed into that function as an argument. That data then travels to the backend, in this case, a Laravel server. On the backend, there's another function waiting to receive it. That function takes the data through its parameter and runs logic to save it to the database. This entire flow, from the user's input all the way to the database, is powered by functions calling other functions and passing data through parameters. So when you're learning about functions and parameters right now, you're not just learning abstract JavaScript concepts. You're learning the fundamental building blocks of how every modern web application works. Let's bring everything together with the key takeaways from this session. First, a function is a reusable block of code. You write the logic once, and you can call it as many times as you need from anywhere in your program. Second, the regular function syntax uses the function keyword, followed by a name, parentheses, and curly braces. Third, the arrow function is the modern, concise alternative. You use const, give it a name, assign it with equals, write the parentheses, add the arrow, and then your code. For single-line functions, you can even drag the curly braces entirely. Fourth, parameters are how you pass data into a function. The data you send when calling the function is called an argument. The variable inside the function that receives it is called a parameter. And fifth, console.log is your debugging tool, used to print things to the console during development. Return is what you use to actually send a value back from a function so it can be used elsewhere. These concepts, functions, parameters, and arrow functions, are the absolute foundation of everything you'll build in React and Filament. Master these, and the rest will follow.